All right, good evening, everyone. All right. We're going to get started here. Thank you all for coming. Thank you so much for being here. It's sure to be a fun and exciting time. Ben has been going around with these ballots, if you're wondering about that. This is a competitive labor history event. There will be a winner declared at the end. And they aren't just a sneaky way for us to also ask about your interest in organizing in Eugene and Springfield and get your contact information. That is not the only reason those exist, but if you wouldn't mind filling out that section of them as well, that would be great. But yeah, so why are we doing this? This all came out of a group within our union. It's with the Graduate Teaching Fellows Federation, the GTFF. Most of you, a lot of your folks are that. This came out of an interest in, I don't know if folks know, back in 2023, UAW's president, Sean Fain, made this bold pitch to align contract dates so that there would be a lot of unions across the country with a legal strike date all on the same day of May 1st, 2028. And this, you know, we're really at a need for inspiring things and things to look forward to and plan for. So a lot of our membership were interested in this, but it's more than just about the legal and technical aspects of contract alignment, which is an interesting strategy, a viable one that's been proven viable by various education unions in particular in different cities. But what you need, in addition to just folks aligning things and having these backroom sort of conversations, is the general public needs to be a lot more aware of why this sort of thing matters and why what can really be accomplished through solidarity and collective action. And so that's where, as you know, as historians, educators, and of various stripes, there's something that we can do here, which is to present to the general public and to our own memberships these ideas and ways that it's worked and not worked in the past. And so something that came to mind in our meetings was to have a series of labor history events where we help educate the general public and ourselves, give us a reason to learn about the history of our movement. You know, we hear all the time, they didn't teach us that in school, this kind of phrase. And when it comes to the history of strikes, the history of collective action, that really is true, right? This isn't part of your public education unless your teacher really liked Howard Zinn and you got to read that book. You know, but that's not for all of us, right? I grew up in a right-to-work state where I didn't know of unions outside of the movies, right? Until really coming here and joining one. So that's enough of me rambling. We've got 5 presenters here tonight who are labor historians, labor scholars, and people currently involved in the labor movement who have each chosen a strike to present to you and to make the case for why it matters, why it mattered at the time, why it still matters now. And so if they would come on up to the stage, we've got Rajiv, Ravi Shankar, Lillian Devane, Colin Heatley, Bob Bussell, and Steve Bita. Great. And Rajiv's going to start us off, so I'm going to pass the mic off to him.
Okay, great.
Do you want the clicker, or do you want me to have it?
Can you? Yeah, that'd be great. Sure. Hi, everyone. Wow, it's a great turnout for a labor history event. I'm coming off of a labor history conference that had a great turnout, so maybe there's some energy around labor history. But thank you, Jacob, for organizing this event and inviting me to take part. My name is Rajiv. I'm former leadership of GTFF, the Graduate Employee Union. I'm a trustee of the Pacific Northwest Labor History Association and a new staff member of the Oregon AFL-CIO. I'll be talking about the Haymarket Affair of May 1886, which you'll hear called as an incident or a riot, so a few different names depending on your disposition. I'll make the case about that what happened at Haymarket is not only one of the most interesting events in the history of the labor movement, but also one of the most significant. It touches on a lot of themes that will resonate today about dangerous immigrants bringing radical ideals, due process issues and justice, police and state repression, freedom of assembly and speech, And I think my first slide is actually a picture that was taken when I was on a labor history tour at one of the Haymarket memorials. More on that in a bit. Next slide. So, I just wanted to talk about the lead up to what happened in Haymarket in May of 1886. You have, struggles around the wage, struggles around time and against the wage system. You had demands for a 10-hour day. And, then the famous slogan of 8 hours for work, 8 hours for sleep, and 8 hours for what you will. No! I know, it sounds nice now still, right? I mean, the U.S. was becoming, at that time, was one of the most violent theaters, for industrial relations, with company and state repression and workers arming themselves to defend themselves. You had the Knights of Labor at the time, which is a major labor organization, which was criticizing the wage system, calling for abolishing it, and having a cooperative commonwealth in its place. And here you have a quote from Frederick Douglass. One of the concepts at the time was that, calling the wage system wage slavery. And this is Frederick Douglass, who had experienced slavery and became a leader of the abolitionist movement, not equating the wage system with slavery, but pointing to the overlapping features given the level of control that employers exerted over workers. Next slide. So a key feature that has to be mentioned when we talk about Haymarket is the role of anarchists, socialists, and communists, many of whom, I know some applause for that, it looks like, many of whom were immigrant workers from Germany, from Eastern European countries who brought these ideas with them. And then you also have people like Lucy and Albert Parsons who were drawn into anarchist politics, who are from, who are in the US. Albert Parsons was actually a Confederate, was in the Confederate Army before radicalizing in favor of militant working class struggle. And he joins with Lucy Carter, who became Lucy Parsons, a mixed race woman who was born into slavery and became drawn to anarchist politics alongside Albert after seeing repression against workers in the 1877 railroad strike. They get committed to this idea, this notion called the Chicago idea, that unions being at the center of a revolutionary strategy and the nucleus of a future society. And they justified revolutionary violence given the repression against workers and the power imbalance in relation to the ruling class, and a political framework that was rigged against workers that made reform difficult. Next slide. So, in the years preceding Haymarket, you actually have a call for a general strike, similar to what we see today, a call for a general strike now or even in the future. You had a call for a general strike 2 years earlier in 1884 by the Knights of Labor and the Federation of Organized Trades and Labor Unions. And then you also had local struggles in Chicago at the McCormick Reaper Works, where there's mechanization of iron molding and a scenario where workers are trying to keep scabs out, and the Pinkerton Detective Agency fired on workers, killing a few of them. And you had calls for a national general strike. You had tens of thousands of workers marching down Michigan Avenue in Chicago, demanding 8 hours for work, and is building up toward this May 4th rally, which ended up being, in the sequence of events, actually was a smaller event, and speakers were finishing up, they were getting ready to leave, and 200 police converged, and a bomb is thrown. A bomb is thrown by someone to this day, nobody knows who threw it, exactly sort of who's behind that. What ended up happening is the bomb kills one police officer, and the police actually open fire and kill 6 police, 4 workers, and injure dozens of other workers. What happens in the aftermath? You have martial law declared, and the incident is used to come after the labor movement. No surprise there. This could be called maybe the first Red Scare. You have labor leaders in prison, labor newspapers shut down, labor organizations like the Knights of Labor taking a major hit. And what you have is, in terms of the side of holding people to account, who was responsible for this, the people who were caught up in this, police arrested many, and 8 were convicted in heavily biased juries. They were charged as accomplices to conspiracy. There's no definitive evidence that any of those who were convicted were actually involved in what happened. 4 were executed, and 1 died by suicide in jail. And, a quote from the Encyclopedia of Chicago is, "It's considered one of the worst miscarriages of justice in U.S. history." And these folks who were convicted were actually pardoned by the Governor Altgeld of Illinois later. And just as a media study student, I have to say, what was media coverage like at the time? Sensationalism was a big problem then, too. You have the New York Times calling for using the Gatling gun solution to deal with anarchists, and to try to put them, to try to deal with them through the use of hemp in judicious doses. You have Chicago newspapers publishing unsubstantiated reports by the police, and depictions of anarchists as bomb-throwing demons. You can go to the next slide. So one of the interesting things about this, so after this incident happens, I mean, it reverberates, it has lasting impacts on the labor movement and society more broadly. And also, there's this way in which the memory of it is deeply contested to this day. You have 3 different memorials to it. One that comes soon after, it was initiated by Lucy Parsons, whose husband actually was executed. Albert Parsons was executed. That's in Waldheim Cemetery in Chicago. You have a more recent one, which is the Haymarket Memorial in downtown Chicago. I think in 2005 that was initiated. You also have a police monument, which which is now behind closed doors or behind gates because it kept getting attacked. And there's lore around this is that I think a streetcar driver was upset seeing this policeman with his hand raised and he ran it over. This isn't fully fleshed out, but there's this lore around that as one of the attacks. And with the most recent Haymarket Memorial, you actually have plaques from workers from all over the world who have said what this means to them and commemorating Haymarket. Next slide. And this is just the quote at the bottom of the original Haymarket Memorial from August Spies, who was one of the 4 people executed. I'm coming from going to Workers' Memorial Day today, which is workers who've died on the job, and remembering them just in the state of Oregon. But I thought just to say the names of the people who were executed: Albert Parsons, Michael Schwab, Adolf Fischer, and August Spies. And these are August Spies' final words: "The day will come when our silence will be more powerful than the voices you are throttling today." Next slide, and this is where I think, just to wrap up, what are we dealing with in terms of the significance? The U.S. doesn't commemorate May Day. I mean, it happens in the U.S., but officially it doesn't. And what happens instead? Every year, whoever is the president declares Loyalty Day. And so Biden declared Loyalty Day last year. We're going to see Trump's declaration this year. It was called Americanization Day earlier. And you see that this is an important feature in the sort of start of the split of the U.S. working class and the international working class. You can go to the next slide. It's the last slide. And it's just a story I like to share. When I was a journalism student in Chennai in India, in southeastern India, I used to always pass by this tea stall called Chicago Tea Stall. And I was like, why is there a Chicago Tea Stall in Chennai? And it was actually that the guy who started it was inspired by what happened in Haymarket in 1886 and started a tea stall offering fair wages to workers at the tea stall and really trying to embrace that tradition. And so just to sort of, as an indication of how far reaching this event was, the global impact of this. And so just, to wrap up, I think Haymarket gives us a glimpse of a very diverse, immigrant-led working class, how many people came together with different ideas, socialist and anarchist ideas, which are foundational to elements of the labor movement. And it reminds us that whatever has been won and whatever space has been opened up has not been because political elites and business elites handed them to us. Is because of what the labor movement won on their own terms. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you Rajiv. Up next, we've got Colin Heatley. Colin is a PhD student, PhD candidate in history at the U of O, where he researches the history of hip-hop and punk culture in Los Angeles. And he's a proud member, organizer, and the current vice president for external relations in the GTFF.
Hi, everybody. Can you all hear me? Cool. Yes, I am from GTFF. I'm wearing a UOSW shirt. Our union siblings on UOSW are on strike right now. Can we give them a round of applause? Okay, so today I'm talking about a major general strike in 1934. This was a critical moment in U.S. labor history, and especially here on the West Coast. And this was the 1934 West Coast waterfront strike, in which tens of thousands of workers in the coastal shipping industry associated with the International Longshoremen's Association went on strike for over 2 months. Can we go to the next slide? Thank you. And that wasn't all. It involved hundreds of thousands more workers from other industries, and most importantly, it had massive buy-in and solidarity from the community allies, which ultimately pushed the workers over the finish line. I'll talk about the context behind the strike, how workers and allies made it happen, why it was an incredible win for labor and democracy, and what we can learn from this moment to build power and get organized together, especially in our current political situation, and looking to that call from Sean Fain on 2028. So to start, a lot of workers' unions in the late 19th and early 20th century, they're highly exclusionary. They organized workers based on skills in the trade, meaning that there were, might be several different unions on the same shop floor. Many were also racially based, and they were anti-immigrant. However, there was a shift to industrial labor organizing in the early 20th century. Rajiv touched on this a little bit, in part due to the mechanized industry changing what the shop floor looks like in manufacturing. And the rise of radical militant unionism, folks like the IWW, the CIO, mainly left-wing radicals, communist socialists played a major part. They wanted to organize workers in wall-to-wall unions along industrial lines, not skill-based, and they wanted it to be inclusive, and they actively pushed against racial boundaries that the craft unions perpetuated. Can we go to the next slide? So this is the Depression era. This is a picture of Hooverville in Seattle. Hoovervilles were shanty towns common during the Depression era. Millions were out of work and desperate. And I mean, the combination of labor militancy and the near total absence of government support from 1929, this is under the Hoover admin, when the Depression began, helped usher in the election of FDR in 1932. His admin passed the National Industrial Recovery Act in 1933, which created several jobs programs, but most importantly, it promoted, although it did not guarantee, collective bargaining rights for workers. Workers now, at this point, this is 1934, right, saw a friendly environment for organizing and around the country across industries. So workers then pushed for union recognition, higher pay, and other rights on the job. Next slide. So this is a couple pictures on the job context. So workers on the waterfront were kind of no different. They're in the same spot. So just in general, working on the waterfront was incredibly dangerous, and it was backbreaking work. So workers would constantly be forced to work anywhere from 12 to 36-hour shifts. I mean, 36 hours is insane. Sometimes with no meal breaks for 10 to 12 hours at a time. Injuries and fatalities were super common, happened daily, and there were no safeguards or recourse for injury pay. Hiring was also completely in the hands of employers, and discrimination was rampant. So employment was essentially totally at will. Thousands of workers would line up at the docks, wait there for sometimes an entire day, and only select workers were able to secure work. This usually entailed some sort of gifts or tributes to the employers, like they had to kind of buy them off, So they literally give them favors, like bottles of alcohol, like Christmas hams and shit like that. Just whatever they could do to get the job. And forget it if they suspected that you were a union organizer or a troublemaker in any sense. Most prevalent was race-based discrimination, in which white workers almost always got the job, or there was massive pay discrepancy for black workers. And part of that discrimination also was the enforcement of company unions. And company unions are not unions the way that we know them, right? They're basically just another way for employers to exercise control over the conditions of employment. So membership was required for employment, it required dues, and this also stifled organizing and fed into this overall culture of fear, intimidation, and surveillance that workers experience daily. Can we do next slide? However, with the FDR admin in power now and their endorsement of collective bargaining and worker rights, organizers, so mostly left-wing radicals, use the moment to push back against this culture of fear and engage workers to join the ILA, the International Longshoremen's Association. I'm going to butcher that name 20 times. Up and down the West Coast, from California all the way to Seattle. They encourage workers to wear union buttons, to refuse to show or even destroy their company union materials, which were actually required for to get employment. And they would stage walkouts on the job in protest. These were exercises in worker solidarity that, this required an unbelievable amount of courage, right? Just think for a second how scary that must have been, and how much those workers were risking by standing in solidarity with each other to refute the intimidation of their employers. It's their whole livelihoods and physical safety on the line. But that's also exactly why they stood together in those moments, and that solidarity totally broke the company's ability to control workers. So, yes. So the ILA had a few key demands. They wanted to negotiate only as a unified district all the way up and down the coast. They wanted to have a maximum 6-hour day, a 30-hour work week, a pay raise and standard set, and arguably most importantly, a union hiring hall, where the union would actually control the hiring process. They committed to hiring equitably, barred any discrimination based on race. And so what happened was the companies refused to recognize the union as a whole and said they only wanted to negotiate port by port. And why would they want to do that? So they could selectively avoid ports with the stronger contracts. So in response, the ILA voted to strike on May 9th, 1934, and 12,000 workers on ports all along the West Coast went on strike. Thousands more from seafaring unions, the people who were actually worked the ships out on sea, and thousands of Teamsters also supported the strike. And so here's the part I want to emphasize, though. This strike was not limited to the ports. Everywhere, but especially in Portland, nearby, ILA members and organizers went to local businesses, they went to churches, they went to community organizations, farmers, lumber workers, and others, and convinced them to support the strike. So one of the pictures here is a local restaurant in Portland that was turned into an ILA kitchen to support striking workers. Also, sex workers in Portland helped striking workers get rooms in hotels and actually prepared food for them too. So, yeah, round of applause. Here's an important point. So this strike had a huge impact on unemployed workers, and many industries like timber, there were tons of layoffs right after this happened. Timber shipping was brought to a standstill. The strike opened up opportunities for employment, and you'd think that those unemployed workers would just go to try to replace the strikers, right? And it was not a given that they were going to just support the strike based on shared class interests or anything like that. And if anything, there's material pressure on them to do the opposite. But because of intentional organizing, particularly by communists and socialists, workers in other industries and those unemployed workers stood in solidarity with the longshoremen. Employers actually had an incredibly difficult time finding scab labor to fill these positions, and any scab laborers were escorted out of the premises by workers. The effect of all of this was all this community buy-in. It was substantial. So you can see here the one newspaper clipping, the combined financial impact after just 18 days in Portland alone was $7.5 million. And I did the calculations for that. That equates to over $178 million today. That's kind of insane. Can we do next slide? So with this immense support from the community, local governments, particularly in San Francisco, Seattle, and Portland, started to use police to escort scab labor, into the dock warehouses. So that you can see here, this is a scene shown here in Portland where they're doing just that. And the chambers of commerce, I was waiting for a boo from that too, but okay. Yeah, thank you. The chambers of commerce in San Francisco and Portland also secretly helped form and fund vigilante groups to break the pickets through violence. The names alone should tell you something. So one of them was called the Citizens Emergency League, and the other one in Portland, shown here on this button, were called the Minutemen, the drawing on Revolutionary War sort of call to civilian action. They were led actually by a World War I ex-commander. These were battalions, right? They included special police units, and they were just vigilante mobs. And perhaps unsurprisingly, police and employers tried to paint the entire strike effort as an attempt at a communist takeover. And that's how they justified their violence. Next slide. So on Thursday, July 5th, 1934, police and vigilantes opened fire into the crowd of striking workers in San Francisco, and they killed 2 of them, Howard Sperry and Nick Bordeaux. The murders are remembered as Bloody Thursday, and the day is actually still observed today as a paid day off in the Longshoremen's Union. California's National Guard was called in. They beat and used tear gas on picketers and fired on their Union Hall. There was a huge funeral procession the next day for those 2, and then the strikers were also beaten and arrested by police at that time as well. And there was police violence in Portland. On July 11th, strikers tried to block a train line that was carrying strike-breaking police officers on their way to an important terminal. And the police opened fire on the workers there too. 4 were critically injured, though no one died. And this happened in a public park, right? And both of these horrific events did not have the effect that police wanted them to. They only further angered and invigorated community members and strikers. And over the coming days, the Teamsters, San Francisco Labor Council, and the equivalent council in Oakland all voted to authorize a general strike. It's estimated that over 150,000 workers participated in this. Yeah. Police violence included raid on Communist Party headquarters, businesses, and other organizations as well during this time. Last slide. So after weeks of chaos and mediation hosted by an FDR-appointed board, the strike came to an end at the end of July. Workers won that coast-wide contract. They won limited hours. They won the increased pay and there's a pay standard. They won that union hiring haul, which is shown here. And most importantly, this was a major victory in just solidarity and for the labor movement as a whole. It helped spur a major, along with a lot of other strikes at the time, helped spur a wave of organizing nationwide, especially here on the West Coast. And along with other strikes, this also pushed the Roosevelt admin and lawmakers to guarantee collective bargaining rights under the Wagner Act a year later in 1935. So a couple important takeaways I want to just highlight. It's important to note the degree to which communists and socialists among the workers led to organizing efforts and led those things. So that is like kind of just like black hole in our historical memories, intentionally as well, similar to what Rajiv was talking about with Haymarket. Also, I'd say that police repression and violence was obviously ubiquitous here and was the case elsewhere as well. And, it's a cliche almost at this point to say that police are there to protect capital, but not protect public safety. But I think that's very clear in this instance. And lastly, I think the most important thing to highlight is that this strike would not have happened, it would not have happened without that community buy-in. It took everybody, right? It took everybody in that community to be able to push them over the finish line. But the bigger question and the thing I want to explore is how did that happen? It happened through one-on-one conversations. Those organizers needed to know how to talk to those shop owners. They needed to know how to talk to those other workers, those community members, and on those unemployed workers to build that solidarity. It was not a given they were going to support this. And I think that piece is missing from a lot of labor history. We have a lot of very top-down materialist labor history that's great in its own right, but a glaring omission from it is what workers actually said to one another, right? And if we're going to build worker power to win the moment, prepare for 2028, we need to know how to organize. So I think that's the biggest lesson that I want to impart to y'all. So thank you.
All right. Thank you, Colin. All right. Yeah. All right. Thank you, Colin. We've got 2 great cases made so far, but don't fill out the ballots yet. There are 3 more presentations. And up next, we have Lillian Devane. Lillian is a staff organizer with Workers United, working on the Starbucks campaign, a former Wayne Morse Fellow, and former VP for organizing for the GTFF. She received her master's degree in folklore and public culture from the University of Oregon with a thesis on organizing and occupational culture at Amazon warehouses. Lillian will be speaking to us about, we're going back in time to the 19th century again. Go ahead, Lillian.
Yeah, walk with me, won't you? Shout out to Light Sky. That was, really beaming in me. That's great. Thank you. I feel spot lit. Thanks, Jacob, for putting this together. Thanks, GTFF, for letting me come here and talk about girl strikes, strikes for girls. Also known as herstory. Just to put some context about what I'm going to talk about, I'm not an academic. I'm just a simple Southern field organizer, and this presentation is sort of a draft of some materials that I'm working on for the Starbucks workers who I work with. So that's why it's like this. Also, to all the historians, if something here is incorrect, no, it isn't. If anything is incorrect, I don't want to know. Do not tell me. I also will not be taking any questions. So shout out UO student workers. We're here with you in solidarity. Love y'all. And shout out to my brothers playing Magic the Gathering. What's up, y'all? Hell yeah. Fucking hell yeah. Okay. So I'm presenting the story of the Pawtucket strike. I realize that I'm choosing another story of like white industrial workers, but we hate that. But I think that by the end of this presentation, you'll be convinced that these little ladies were up to something special. And I think I chose this because I think it highlights the important tactics that are, germane to our current struggle in the labor movement. I think you'll find that history truly did happen, okay? And could it be repeating itself? Okay, slide 2, please. So setting the scene, we have some key players in my tale this eve. I got a lot of my info from Gary Kulik's article, Pawtucket Village and the Strike of 1824, The Origins of Class Conflict in Rhode Island. We're going all the way to gorgeous Rhode Island. Has anyone here been to Rhode Island? Hell yeah, you know how to live. I have been to Pawtucket, don't recommend. Do not, some like abandoned bowling alleys. Okay, so, sorry, Bob. I love New England, don't get me wrong. Don't give me, oh my God, they already hate me. Okay, okay, flop sweat. Okay, so, I have to get into this. So, okay, these are the key players. We got Sam Slater, boo. He's British, we hate that, and he's the owner of one of the mills, and he's bad. Okay, we have the power loom, took great jobs away from children, okay? The kids loved their jobs working for 12 hours, 13, 14 hours, okay? And this power loom ended that, okay? It's fucked up. Okay, and then we have the mill workers themselves and their community. We love to see it. They hated the textile industry and also not being paid. And then we have arson, which is effective. Okay, I'm... Sorry. Okay, yeah, let's please move on. Okay. So just a little bit of background, Pawtucket at the time. Again, this is not my area of research, so I am truly just out here with you guys. So essentially, Sam Slater came all the way from England with some technology and was like, I can make this new kind of mill. It uses water. Check this shit out. And everyone was very excited. There were some embargoes and tariffs going on. And so the American textile business was booming, popping off, if you will. So Pawtucket went from a small, hideous town, much like today, to being one of the, I'm just razzing you guys. I love New England, as I said to Bob Bussell earlier. So anyways, so now it's kind of like a booming, center of industry. Just so you know, the kind of way that this was all working at the time was that Sam Slater would scoop up orphans, and he would be like, hey, guess what? It's called an apprenticeship, except because you don't get paid. And you get paid in room and board, and you're like 7. The kids were like, sounds cool. Maybe. No, they hated it, obviously. And they were spinning cotton into thread, right? That was their bag, so to speak. So Sam was also known to light candles so they could work at night. So candlelit sounds romantic, but I think it fucking sucked, actually. So this was kind of the conditions they were working in. Power looms, boo, no, they're fine. Power looms came in and increased production, right? And also shifted the labor needs so that they required a different type of technique, right? And they required adults, hate to see it, adults had to get some jobs, right? And take those jobs away from children, which is sad. So women, boo, just kidding. Women began to enter the workforce. Okay. Wow. Okay, yeah, that's great. Yeah, it doesn't matter what slide we're on. I'm just going to kind of talk. So here are the vibes. So just that's kind of the background, boring history stuff. Sorry, guys. But the vibes right now was that this town was not just a bunch of hick farmers, much like today in Rhode Island. It's a bit I decided to do. The town was they weren't just chill with everything that was going on. And this is an important point because we don't think about the kinds of acts of resistance and sabotage and pushback that have been going on for a really long time. And this town was they fucking hated the textile mill day one, okay? These guys were coming in, they're putting dams in to try to get power, and the farmers and the townspeople would be fucking destroy it. They would do all sorts of stuff to push back. At every level of this town was kind of like building up, right? So it had this like culture of opposition already. The townspeople were like, fuck you, we hate this, we hate what you're doing, we're doing legal disputes, you know, power rights over water. Like they were in it already. They were fighting from day one. So God bless. They also were like kind of crazy. Like they were just like body wasted all the time. They were always like swimming nude in public, like truly just like out of control because like, yeah, you work like 14 hours. It's like, that's what I want to do when I work like 4 hours. Like I get it. You know what I mean? So they were really like, that was the vibe. They were actively destroying things they hated. They were having fun after work. Sounds fucking cool to me. So that's kind of the vibes. And then also, this is before owners, the owning class, they didn't know that they shouldn't build their mansions like right by the factories and mills. That's what these guys did. It was a big oopsie. Now they kind of build it up away, right? So there was this really clear class divide in town that everyone was like, that's the rich guy, right? And then also, at the time, 1824, there's a volatile market. I don't know how this works, but overproduction and declining cloth prices. Things were a little hinky. And so, of course, what's the decision there? What's a business owner to do? Just kidding. Cut labor costs. Cut labor. And the twist, just for girls. Okay. Can you? Okay. So the owners were like, we're cutting wages just for the weavers. So the women came in to use the power looms, right? And they were like, we're cutting the wages here just for women, but we're also extending the workday. Doesn't that sound cool for everybody? Does everybody love that, right? So all the mill owners in town came together, made these decisions. They're like, the women, they're already making really extravagant wages for women. They don't even know what they should be making. It'll be fine. They won't make a fuss. But they were really fucking wrong. They were like, couldn't have been more wrong. So they announced this change, right, to cutting wages and extending the workday. The literal next day, the actual next day, they were like, there will be no working at the mill here in Pawtucket. So, which is like, let's fucking go. So this is just a description of what happened. It says, the female weavers assembled in Parliament to the number, it is stated, of 102. One of the most active and most talkative was placed in the chair. Okay, you know that bitch was good, okay? And in the meeting, it is understood, was conducted, however strange it may appear, without noise or scarcely a single speech. The result of the meeting was a resolution to abandon their looms unless allowed the old prices. Let's go. By the way, there's only sources are just like newspapers that the mills owned. So like those are the sources we have for this. So yeah, the next day like the whole community, not just the women who worked there, but all of the people in the town who already hated all these guys anyways, they crowded in front of the mill entrances and they're like, don't go in, don't go to work. Don't go, you're cool, don't go to work today. And so bit by bit, this spread until all of the mills were closed down. They gathered at the mansions. They were like screaming all night, like insulting the owners, like throwing stuff, breaking windows, being absolutely old-timey ruckus. You get the idea. I know, we absolutely love it. And then on June 1st, a mysterious fire started in the old yellow mill down the holler. Maybe. And then the very next day, and this is Gemini season, the very next day, a compromise was reached. They were like, okay, girlies. They were like, okay, we hear you. We see you. We're listening. We're learning. And we'll give you something. So I guess, essentially, we don't really know exactly what they got. But we do know that a compromise was reached and that, you know, they didn't cut all of their wages. I'm sure they a little bit, but we don't know the exact terms. We do know that they got something that they wanted from collective action, which we love to see it. And then I guess just as like a larger cultural sort of, comment after this happened, they immediately were like, we need more police, we need more churches, nobody can drink, we're gonna have parades that link industry to patriotism, let's go. Like, they were completely like, this can never happen again. Boo, that sucks so much. Okay, and then last slide. So I know I've been like goofing around. This is what a master's degree at the University of Oregon gets you, everybody. This is the folklore department. Shout out folklore department. Okay. So, all jokes aside, which has been everything I've said, is that I just want to say that like spontaneous organizing is a myth, right? Like the idea that like in Clara Lemlich in the uprising of 20,000, like one woman stands up and she says, we're all going on strike tomorrow. And then everybody follows her. It's like this one person stood up and made the... We know that that's not how this works. Like all of us here know that doesn't work. And I bet you that all of these women in this factory had been talking for a long time about how much this fucking sucked. And they were like, what's going to be the last straw? Sam Slater, right? So thinking about that, like this takes work, this takes talk, like Colin was saying, one-on-one, right? I know those girls were yapping, okay? And then also, it takes a village, right? Like this was made possible by guys starting fires, other guys backing, and maybe kids backing up these women who were like, we're not going to take this anymore, right? It took the whole village. They were already pissed off. They were like, let's go. Let's stand in solidarity together. And also, like, movements are contagious. This spread throughout the region. You know, 10 years-ish later, one of the first women's unions was formed in, you know, nearby Lowell, I think, Bob. And so you've heard of the Lowell Mill Girls. Well, now you know about the Pawtucket strike. So a little, you know, a less famous, I guess, example. And I guess lastly, like these women were not in a union. So like, but they did it anyway. So you just have to like act like one. It doesn't matter necessarily if you have a contract, just fucking act like one and get what you want. So that's all I have to say. Thank you all so much. Solidarity forever.
All right, thank you, Lillian. Thank you, Lillian. So the Lowell Mills, contagious organizing, a plug for arson, Comrade Arson. Next up is Bob Bussell. Bob is a professor emeritus at the UO History Department and a former director of the Labor Education Resource Center, LERC. He's been associated with the union movement for more than 50 years, including over 10 years as a union staffer and nearly 3 decades as a university-based labor educator. Bob's going to talk to us about Charleston in 1969.
Is this on? You hear me? Okay. Thank you, Jacob. Can you just give me a 2-minute warning?
Yes.
Okay. So let me start off with a question. How many of you, show of hands, have heard of the Memphis sanitation strike in 1968? Okay. How many of you have heard about a strike a year later among hospital workers in Charleston, South Carolina? Well, you're a ringer. Yeah. And I picked a strike that is relatively more obscure because I think we can actually learn a lot from this one in particular. This was a strike that went on in the spring of 1969 at a medical center and a county hospital in Charleston, South Carolina, and it attracted national attention. And you have to recall that healthcare hospitals and healthcare were a real organizing frontier back in the late 60s, early 70s, and beyond. And this strike, there's a wonderful movie that was made about it, if you can ever find it. It's called I Am Somebody. And that gives you a sense of the flavor of what was going on here. So there are 4 insights about this strike that I think are particularly important. One is that it demonstrates the connection between civil rights and the quest for economic justice. You could even call this civil rights unionism, an example of that. It highlights the connection between race and gender because most of the people involved in this strike and its leadership and its activism were black women. It shows that strikes can often have larger political implications beyond a workplace. In fact, they can become, well, not so much in this case, but so let me say that I'm going to be a little bit more of the downer here because I think the results of strikes can be mixed. They're not always slam dunk victories, but sometimes their effects do reverberate. You have to take a longer period of time to see how they play out. So let me give you first a little bit of context about this strike. South Carolina, where this strike occurred, it was the richest of the 13 colonies because enslaved Africans who had knowledge and skill helped build the production of rice in South Carolina. Very profitable industry. Some of you may know the Stono Rebellion in 1739, one of the most famous slave rebellions that occurred there. Then, after the brief promise of Reconstruction, there was a long period of white supremacy, segregation, racial subordination. Some of you may recall one of the exemplars of this was the senator from South Carolina, Strom Thurmond, who recently had his filibuster record broken by Cory Booker. The textile industry in particular, and I know a fair amount about this because that was my union, they were a strong bulwark of anti-unionism. So South Carolina had a very low rate of unionization. It still does. It's actually the third least unionized state in the nation. Right to work laws, prohibitions on public employee strikes. By the 1960s, after the Civil Rights Act, black workers begin to migrate from the fields and from domestic service into service occupations in manufacturing. However, conditions remain really bad. In 1970 in South Carolina, 40% of black families fell below the poverty line. So the organizing involved a medical college hospital associated with the University of South Carolina and a county hospital. To give you an idea of the flavor of all of this, there were no black doctors at this hospital. There was not one black student in the nursing school. Mary Moultrie, one of the strike leaders, was trained as a licensed practical nurse but could only find work as a nurse's aide. There's a host of dignity and respect issues that permeate throughout this strike, and as I think we all know, those are some of the most powerful ones, right? When you're dealing with basic dignity and respect. One of the triggering incidents before the strike, there were some black nursing assistants who protested when they were not allowed to read the charts of white patients. They did get reinstated, but another example, black workers were relegated to eating their lunch in bathrooms and in boiler rooms, not in the cafeteria. Lots of derogatory racial statements and taunts, pretty bad place. Can you put the first slide up? And I'm just going to get up for these so I can see them as well. And this is a quote from Coretta Scott King, who came to Charleston, and you get a sense here of another important way in which this strike was framed. And you see the intersection here between race and gender. But I think the idea about a wage being an insult is a very important one. Let's go to the next slide, and this will give you an idea of what they were up against. William McCord was the president of this medical college hospital, and this is a quote, I believe, that he delivered in speaking with Business Week magazine. So the way I like to think about this is I think he hit the trifecta: classism, racism, and sexism, right? So that's what they're up against. There was a lot of grassroots and civil rights organizing that preceded the strike. There were local activists who were involved, and they start to go to the hospital and start to present their grievances. First, the hospital says it'll only talk to individuals, and then later it packs a meeting with people loyal to the hospital. There are a group of workers that go into McCord's office, 12 of them. They just talk to him directly, and one of the things he says that really provokes them is he says, "I'll offer you an extra holiday. Robert E. Lee's birthday." So after an abortive meeting with McCord, 12 union activists are fired, a strike begins. There are about 400 people from the hospital, and then about 50 or more county hospital workers join. There are two basic demands: rehire the people who got fired and recognize the union. Now, you begin to see, here's the political part, that the entire power structure in the state of South Carolina lines up against the Union. So next slide. This is, can you get the next slide? Yeah. This is the governor of South Carolina speaking to the South Carolina Bar Association in May of '69. And what you see is this, it's a domino theory, right? That if one of these dominoes falls, their whole business model of attracting industry to South Carolina because it's going to be non-union, they're really fearful about that. And we saw this recently with the auto workers, right? When all these governors came out because they know. They really fear certainly black workers organizing, they fear interracial organizing, and this is how they saw this. So what happens is they call out state troopers, they call out the National Guard, they get injunctions, there's mass arrests, and it gets very ugly very, very quickly. Now I want to, and I just have to say this too, you know, the idea about South Carolina, how this has continued. Anybody know the name Nikki Haley? Kind of a so-called moderate. She's virulently anti-union. In her inaugural addresses, she always pointed that out. The current governor of South Carolina, the same thing. It's like it's in the water there or something. In any case, oh, also there was a union organizer's hotel room that got firebombed during this strike as well. So this is the type of repression they're up against. Now quickly, District 1199 becomes the union that helps them organize. Martin Luther King Jr. called it his favorite union. They were a branch of the Retail Wholesale Drugstore Union in New York. They were organized mostly by Jews who were leftists and communists. They went out from pharmacies and started organizing hospitals. They're organizing black workers, Latinx workers in New York, Puerto Ricans and Dominicans. They're very successful. But they had things going for them in New York that they didn't necessarily have in South Carolina, a relatively more favorable political culture. There were subsidies available for hospitals in terms of helping with the settlements. There were elected officials that were sympathetic, and there were workers willing to mobilize and go on strike. So it's a little bit reminiscent of the New Deal circumstances in some measure. So what happens when 1199 goes south? They attempt to nationalize the strike. They bring in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which, as you may recall, Dr. King's union loyalties ran really deep way before Memphis. Think about the Poor People's Campaign, interracial movements of the poor. SCLC, after his assassination, is really looking to get its footing back again, and South Carolina presents itself as an opportunity to make the connection between civil rights and economic justice. They help mobilize the black community. There's lots of rallies. There's boycotts of local businesses. The National AFL-CIO, the UAW, they all get involved. Members of Congress urge mediation to settle the strike. But, and here's the sobering part, the hospital was able to find enough scabs to keep it running. And the union ultimately, at least, how are we doing time-wise?
Yeah. 3.
3? Okay, great. I can do this. I can do this. So ultimately, you know, they said they realized they didn't quite have as much leverage as they had had in New York, and ultimately federal intervention actually becomes important. The Department of then Health and Education and Welfare, HEW, now HHS, and we won't talk about them, joke. In any case, they're doing a civil rights audit on the healthcare and hospital systems in South Carolina, and they find a shit ton of, it's an academic word, a lot of civil rights violations, and they're starting to worry, and the former head of the Congress of Racial Equality is an assistant secretary of HEW, oddly enough, under Nixon. They're worried that they might lose federal funds. So this starts to create some pressure for a settlement. And here's kind of an interesting sort of personal human interest side of the story. The settlement of the strike occurs in part through a sidebar between Andrew Young, who's one of the top leaders of SCLC, and a doctor named James Colbert. You might actually recognize from that surname his son, Stephen, who's the talk show host. James Colbert tragically died, and some of you may know this, died in a plane crash in two of Stephen Colbert's brothers. But James Colbert, and there's a wonderful segment on the Colbert Report from some years ago where he and Andy Young talk about this, how here's a guy that I could do business with, and they come up with a settlement. Now, unfortunately, it doesn't get union recognition. They get a grievance procedure, they got a modest wage increase, but they do not get as much as they wanted. They just didn't have the leverage for that. But some other impacts of the strike are important. Black political power in Charleston. There's much more black representation. Voting rights. People vote more, and the voting registration soars. And 1199 uses the Charleston strike as an example elsewhere. When they go to Baltimore and are organizing Johns Hopkins, they basically say to them, if you don't recognize the union, we're going to go Charleston on you. And that's strong. So it's important to realize that you have to look at these things over a bit of a longer period of time. But I do want to say, and again, just to indicate, the South remains really one of the major historical challenges, barriers for the American Union movement. There's good organizing going on down there, but South Carolina, still only 2.8% of people are organized. And while it's not only a lack of unionization, I do want to point out that if you look at all the indicators of the quality of life, education, health care, child care, South Carolina ranks near the bottom on all of these. Nikki Haley's South Carolina miracle, a crock. So finally, I just want to close with a quote from a worker about, I think, the deeper meaning of what's the impact that strikes can actually have on people. We really don't want to lose that. So this is from a worker named Laddie Mae Glover, if you could put that up. And you never know where you might find people from these events, and I know in my own experience I would find people as an organizer, veterans of some of these struggles where they didn't win. But the auto workers found this out in the 30s, other unions found this out, that these people have these memories, and these memories carry on. So even if you don't win the slam dunk victory, I think you have to take the long view, and people really can come out of this feeling reborn and knowing that I am somebody. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Bob. That was a beautiful way to end that. Finally, our last presenter is Steve Beta. Steve is a professor and a union steward in the history department at the University of Oregon. His book, Strong Winds and Widowmakers, Workers, Nature, and Environmental Conflict in Pacific Northwest Timber Country, won the Philip Taft Labor History Book Prize in 2022. In addition to his historical work, Steve's writing on current events has been published in many places, including the Washington Post, the Guardian, and just last month, you had an article in the New York Public about things happening with the Trump administration. Is that right?
No.
No? Oh, the date's wrong on that one.
Really?
No.
Or maybe something got republished?
Something republished. That's what it must be.
Okay.
It was on the website.
Yeah. Yeah,
All right.
I'll take it if they're going to. I'll add it to my CV. Why not? Great. Thank you, Jacob, for organizing this event. Thank you all to being here. And I know everyone has already said it, but I don't think it could be said enough. This is a panel about historic strikes, and UOSW is now, this is the first strike at UO, right?
No, not 2014.
Oh, grad students in 2014.
Yeah.
First strike in recent history at UO. So, and a student worker union at UO is also historic. So, yeah. All right. So, I hate to be the fly in the ointment here. Many of my fellow panelists talked about some of labor's great successes, some of its most inspirational stories, some moments where solidarity overcame racism, overcame structural inequities, overcame worker injustices. I'm going to tell a story where that did not happen. And here's the thing about labor history is we labor historians are romanticists to a fault, and I am as guilty of this as anyone else, right? We are attracted to those stories of when workers with seemingly little power can find their collective power, organize, come together, and beat back big corporations, beat back the forces of white supremacy or sexism. But the truth of the matter is, at least in American labor history, for every great story like that, for every 1935 longshoreman strike, there are a dozen, if not 100, failures. And I think if we're really going to learn from history, and we're going to use history as a guide to help us be better organizers in the present and future, we have to pay as much attention to labor's failures as its victories and learn something from the failures so that we can understand, first and foremost, some of the challenges and hurdles we face, but also so that we understand what to avoid and what mistakes not to make. So today I'm going to be talking about the 1981 PATCO strike. Before I get to that strike, though, I want to talk about a more recent strike a little bit closer to home, and that is the Bigfoot beverage strike. So, well, woo for Teamsters Local 206 and 324, the unions and the members of those unions representing it. Boo for Bigfoot, obviously. So for those of you who don't know, the strike started in September when Bigfoot Beverages more or less unilaterally moved employees from a pension system to a 401k. Something that was, yes, boo indeed, something that was likely in violation of the contract and likely illegal. And understandably, completely reasonably, workers protested, and when those protests fell on deaf ears, they went on strike. However, Bigfoot has been persisting through the strike, mostly by hiring replacement workers. Boo indeed. And recently, the Teamsters locals have instructed their members to go back to work to essentially end the strike. And now Bigfoot Beverage is saying that very few of the Teamsters who went on strike will be able to be rehired because of the way labor law exists. Essentially, they can hire permanent replacement workers and to replace workers on strike. And when strikers go back to work, they can get on a list that will allow them to work should any new positions be open. And Bigfoot Beverages essentially used this to decertify the union. So not only was this an attack on workers' pension, it was more broadly an attack on Teamsters Local 206 and 324 at Bigfoot Beverages here in Oregon. And this strategy is a strategy that many employers have used in recent memory. Provoke a strike with something that is potentially illegal, certainly something that is going to upset a lot of workers in their employ, provoke that strike, then hire permanent replacement workers and decertify the union as a way of kicking unions out of your workplace. And that is a strategy that really started and was really used to greater effect, and one of the big consequences of the 1981 PATCO strike. So, let's now go back in time to 1981 when the Professional Air Traffic Controllers Organization, PATCO, is bargaining its new contract in 1981. So negotiations opened in February of that year. And PATCO was seeking a $10,000 a year raise, and more importantly, a 32-hour work week. Now, we would all love a 32-hour work week, especially those of us in academia. But what the PATCO members argued was that a 32-hour work week was vitally necessary for air traffic safety. As many of us know, air traffic controllers have extremely stressful jobs. And the FAA was demanding that they work shifts that many PATCO members believed were too long, that air traffic controllers couldn't stay sharp through the duration of their shift, and that this was impacting safety. And in fact, PATCO itself had been founded directly out of air traffic controllers' concern to maintain a safe transportation system, air transportation system. It really emerged out of 1969 following a horrific airplane accident, and what the government investigations found thereafter was that this accident happened largely because air traffic controllers were extremely stressed out and that they were working shifts that were far too long. And despite the findings of this investigation, the FAA did not change its rules regarding shifts for air traffic controllers, so workers took things into their own hands, organized a union and started demanding more reasonable working hours that would not only protect them, but protect anyone flying out of America's airports. So that is one of the major things driving negotiations in 1981. The FAA countered PATCO's offer with a small pay raise and no changes to the work week. PATCO members rejected that offer and went out on strike beginning on August 3rd, 1981. 13,000 workers went on strike. It effectively shut down America's air transportation system. Following the start of the strike, more than 7,000 flights were canceled, and this had the potential to do significant, or to be a significant economic disruption, not just on the American airline industry, but the entire American economy. Now, when PATCO's workers went out on strike, they violated a 1955 law that prohibited federal employees from striking. Boo, yes. Now, while this law had been on the books since 1955, it had never been enforced. Well, enter one of the main characters of our story, Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan was elected on a promise to restore American greatness. He was elected on a promise to, quote, make America great again. Sounds familiar, yes? And he was elected on a promise to boost America's economy and pull it out of the doldrums of the 1970s. So he interpreted the PATCO strike as a direct threat to the promises he had made to become president. He interpreted the PATCO strike as a direct threat to his authority as president. And he believed that the PATCO strike needed to be brought to an abrupt end if he was going to meet his campaign promises, to restore the American economy, and, as we all know, to bring organized labor to heel. So once the strike began, the Reagan administration immediately issued a statement declaring the strike a, quote, peril to national safety, and it ordered the strikers back to work within 48 hours, and if they did not return to work in 48 hours, they would forfeit their jobs. Only 1,300 of the 13,000 PATCO strikers returned to work. Well, yes, and yes, On August 5th, 1981, Reagan fired the remaining 11,345 PATCO workers who remained on strike, and then banned them from ever working in the federal government again. So the strike was ended, and PATCO was ultimately decertified on October 22nd, 1981. It was replaced by the National Air Traffic Controllers Association, which functioned more or less as a company union for its duration. It still exists now. There's never been a strike through NATCA. It is, like I said, more or less a company union. So the PATCO strike has had several long-standing and important consequences. The first one was on the actual air traffic controlling system. As you might imagine, it takes a while to train an air traffic controller. You can't just simply replace them. But that is what the FAA did. It rushed people through the training pipeline. So flying in the years after 1981 was arguably more dangerous. There was a shortage of air traffic controllers for several years following the 1981 PATCO strike. So it did have a huge economic impact. Despite all this, and despite the fact that it actually made flying more dangerous and less economically efficient, Reagan really won the public relations campaign. He came off as looking tough, as looking like the hero who restored order to America's economy, who took on quote-unquote big labor and came out victorious. Also, the problem is the PATCO workers, they were more middle-class employees than they were, working-class employees like dock workers or healthcare workers. And so many Americans believed that they were asking too much. They were asking for something they themselves did not have. So they sided with Reagan more than they did PATCO workers. Also, the strike came in, right at the height of the summer travel season, so many tourists had their summer travel plans disrupted, which also did not curry favor for the strikers. So the long and short of it is Reagan emerges as the hero of the story. PATCO, if not all of organized labor, emerges as the villains of the story. And Reagan uses this as a mandate to push through a lot of anti-labor policies and politics through the remainder of his presidency, including stacking the NLRB, the National Labor Relations Board, with anti-union members, of completely rehauling the Department of Labor and essentially installing people within the Department of Labor who had long histories of being active in union busting. He also shrinks the Office of Civil Rights within the Department of Labor, as well as other offices within the Department of Labor. So essentially many of the important mechanisms that the federal government had been, or many important mechanisms that had protected the rights of workers within the federal government were dismantled following PATCO because the strike and the public relations campaign thereafter gave Reagan the ability to do so. The bigger consequences, arguably, were for organized labor. So organized labor in America had been going into decline since the mid-1970s, and it likely would have continued that decline whether PATCO strike had happened or not. However, I think you certainly could and probably should argue that the PATCO strike hastened the pace of that decline. So prior to the PATCO strike, even though employers had a legal right to replace strikers or permanently replace strikers, since the 1950s, they had rarely, if ever, had done so. But once they saw Reagan do it at a federal level, this gave many employers a green light to go ahead and, replace strikers with permanent replacements and then take steps to decertify unions. So this practice that has been rarely followed for most of the later 20th century now becomes a standard practice in many American businesses. And so what companies would start doing is provoking strikes and then immediately hiring permanent replacement workers and decertifying unions. This is the same strategy that Bigfoot Beverages used. And again, like I said, they took that strategy directly from this era in American labor and economic history. So as a result, striking became a lot more dangerous and a lot more difficult for many unions. And the number of large strikes declined significantly from 1980s onwards. So major strikes, that is to say strikes involving more than 1,000 workers, fell from 200 in 1980 to 17 in 1999 to 11 in 2010. Now, hopefully that might be changing, but the point is because now employers have been given a green light by the federal government to use this tool, it is much more difficult and much more dangerous for workers to go on strike. And the strike, as we all know, as our union siblings in UOSW know, a strike is such an important tool that we as workers have to make sure that the economic playing field is level, to make sure that our wages keep up with inflation and the rising productivity that most employers demand from us. That the strike is it's often our tool of last resort, but it is our most fundamental and important tool. And when that has been removed from us and removed from organized labor, it is much more difficult for we as workers to demand fair wages and to demand other fair working conditions. And not surprisingly, as many of I'm sure you know, you can look at all the economic data, right, is that the number of hours that workers increase has gone up dramatically since the 1980s. The productivity expected from workers has gone up dramatically from the 1980s. What has not gone up since the 1980s, or at least not gone up in the same rate as inflation? Wages. And that is one of the big consequences of the PATCO strike. So again, I after such 4 other just spectacular, rousing, important, inspiring stories from labor history, I hate to end us with a sadder story. But like I said, I think it's important that we consider the sad stories next to the inspiring stories, and that we we understand the successes as well as the failures. And so we understand what we're truly confronting so we can build an actually not just inspiring labor movement, but an effective labor movement. So,
All right.
Thank
you,
you.
Steve. All right. All right, we do have time for some questions. Ben's got more ballots to pass out if there's anyone who needed a ballot to decide which of these you think